Hello and welcome to another training video. Now in this video we're going to take a look at this thing called referencing. Now what this actually means is how do we refer to things in Excel. Now we're going to start off on this workbook here, and if I just simply in a cell say equals and click on another cell, you'll see that rather than putting in the text or the value from that cell, it's putting it in as a reference, so it refers to the value that's in that cell. And when I press enter, you'll notice that it doesn't bring through the formatting, it only links to the data that's in that cell. And as you see in the formula bar, it says this cell is equivalent to whatever is in A2. Now we can actually do this from another sheet as well, which is quite useful. So we could, for example, have here a summary sheet, and here I could say equals, and then change sheets, and click on a cell. And now the important thing here is not to change sheets back again before you press enter. And now if we look at the formula bar, it refers to the sheet name and then an exclamation mark and then the cell reference. Now we can even take this a stage further, because if I have my additional workbook as I have here, what I can do is I can say equals and this time change workbooks to the other Excel file, and now go to my simple reference sheet and click on that cell. You'll notice it now refers to the file name, then the sheet name with exclamation, and then the cell reference. But there's something different about this cell reference now, in that it has the dollar signs on it. We're going to talk about the dollar signs in a minute. Again, we must not change workbooks back or change sheets here before we press enter. So what we notice in this workbook, we see the reference to the other data. Now, let's have a look and see what happens if I close that first workbook. Now, it is going to ask me if I want to save it. I am going to say yes, I do want to save it. And now it has the path as well as the file name and the sheet reference and the cell reference. Now that is very clever, because what it actually means is that I've created a connection to the other workbook, and every time I now close and open this workbook, it's going to ask me if I want to enable that connection. So let me just first of all close this workbook down. So I do Control W to close the workbook, and I'm going to save it. And now I'm going to go into just simply open the workbook again. Click on File, and we'll see this was my data report. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to change what was in that first cell. So I'm going to change this to Bill. When I press enter, you'll notice that the reference on the same sheet has updated. The reference on the other sheet has also updated. And now if I close and save this workbook, what do you think has happened in the other workbook that referred to that cell? Well, you might think it's also changed, but in fact it hasn't. If I go to Report, you'll notice that when it opens it still says Oaks, it doesn't say Bill. And the reason is because I haven't enabled the content, so the connection to the other workbook has not been allowed to just go ahead and do that connection. As soon as I press Enable Content, it then opens that workbook in the background as read-only, gets the data from that specific cell and sheet, pastes it into the workbook here, and then closes the workbook down in the background. Now, because it opens it read-only, it means that other people could well have that workbook open at the same time as I'm refreshing this workbook. Okay, I'm now going to close and save that one and go back to my original workbook. Now I mentioned that what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at that dollar sign and see what the dollar sign means. And this is to do with how we actually refer to things. So we have two different types of references. We have what's called an absolute and what's called a relative. Now, you can call these fixed or locked and unlocked, but the correct term is absolute for the fixed ones and relative for the others. Now in here, if I refer to that cell there with the 1, you might think it's referring to A2, but in fact it's not. It's referring to 1, 2 to my left. Now we can demonstrate this. If I just do Control Enter and then fill that down, you'll see that each of these that I've copied refers to the cell 2 to its left. Now that's useful because when I'm doing a formula, what I generally want to do is refer to things in the same row and then always refer to things relatively in the row that I'm in with the formula. Now one way of doing this is by, instead of clicking with the mouse to refer to a cell, use the arrow keys. So if I use the arrow key twice, that refers to the cell 1, 2 to my left. And if I now say plus and use the arrow key just once, that refers to 2 to my left plus 1 to my left. Control Enter and fill down, and we'll see that the bottom one, when I test it, it is 2 to the left plus 1 to the left, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want. But the problem comes when I want to refer to something which I always want to be the same value. So I want to refer to here the cell on the left multiplied by the 10%. So we start off the same, equals left arrow multiplied by, now this time I'm going to do the up arrow, Control Enter and fill down, and here's the problem, because it has also brought down the fact that I referred to the cell above me each time. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to refer to the 10% each time. So what I should have done was said equals the cell on my left times the cell above me, which is locked. Now the way I locked it was to press the F4 key. Now the F4 key puts the $ before the component part that's locked. Now here the D has a $ before it and the 1 has a $ before it. So that means it's locked in column D and locked in row 1. Now that is what I want, so I do Control Enter and double click to fill down. Test it, the cell on my left multiplied by the 10%. Okay, so let's take this the next stage. Let's talk about what's called a mixed reference. Now a mixed reference is where I've got the value in there that I want, but I want to build that formula across multiple columns. And actually, it might be that that formula is not going to work properly if we had it built in the same way that we did in the first workbook. So if I just said the cell on my left times the cell above me, which is locked, when I drag it across, it doesn't give me the correct answer. Remember on the last one, I dragged it across and it gave me the 1, which was the correct value. Now it's giving me a 0.05, but why? Well, because that cell there is referring to the cell on my left multiplied by the 10%, which is fixed. What I actually wanted was I wanted to refer to not the cell on my left, but the cell in the same row that I'm in, always in column C. So when I go across, it will always be the one in column C and the 5, but when I come down, it will be whatever's in the row that I'm in, and when I go across, it will also always stay in column C. So the always in is the key part of that phrase. So here I say equals not just the cell on my left, but I press F4, and that's locked in both. So that will always refer to C2. So it will always be the 5, which is not what I want, because as I come down, I want it to be the 7. So I press the F4 again. Now this has a $ before the 2, which means it will always be in row 2, which again, when I come down, that will always refer to the 5, which is not what I want. So I press the F4 key again. It's now locked in column C, but relative to the row that I'm in, which is row 2. So that is what I want, because as I come down, I want it to refer to the row that I'm in, but when I move across to the right, I always want it to refer to column C. Now it's that number multiplied by, now here I refer to the 10%, but I don't refer to it as the thing in D1, I'm referring to it as the thing in the same column that I'm in, always in row 1. So the always in, remember, is the thing that needs to be locked. So the always in row 1, I want $1. So that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. So equals the cell on the left, F4, 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 multiplied by the cell above, F4, F4. Control Enter. And now we can copy this one across, or fill it across, and then immediately fill it down. Test. Yes, yes. Test, yes, yes. So that is absolutely what we want. And this is what they call a mixed reference. So I've used $ in part of the reference, but not in the other part of the cell reference. Now there is another type of reference we can use, which is called a dynamic reference. Now this is where I want to refer to an expanding range dynamically. Now here my running total would be 1, but here my running total is 2 plus 1. Here my running total is 3 plus 2 plus 1. So I want the range to expand depending on where I am. So I'm going to use a formula which says equals sum. So this means add the things together. I'm going to click in that cell and do a colon and then keep clicked in that cell. So what it's actually saying is B3 to B3. But the clever part is, if I take just the first part of that, and it doesn't matter whether it's the first part or the second part, and lock it, what that will then refer to is B3, which will always be B3, up to whatever row I'm in, the cell on my left. So let's have a test of that. When I fill it down and go to the bottom one, it goes from B3, which is locked, down to whichever one I'm in, which is B8. If I go to this one, B3, which is locked, down to B5 because I'm in row 5. So there we have what's called a dynamic reference or an expanding range. The very last one I want to talk about is a named reference. And what we can have here is, rather than referring to a cell by B2, for example, we can refer to it by a human speak label. So if I want that number there to be referred to as Oaks, that number there to be referred to as Bill, that one Joe, that one Fred, and actually all of them together to be referred to as numbers, I can do that very easily. Now the simple way of doing it is, if you have what's called labels touching your data, you can simply do Control A to select all of that data range, and then you can do Control Shift F3, and this brings up the naming to name the selection, and it uses the thing in the top row and the left column because it's automatically detected that I have some numbers here and I have something above them which I probably want to be the label. I have some numbers here and something to the left which I probably want to be the label. So actually yes I do, and I'm going to click OK. Now it doesn't seem to have done anything, but actually if I look over here in my name box, if I were to choose Bill, it selects the number that is Bill. If I were to choose Oaks, it selects the one that is Oaks, and if I were to choose numbers, it will select all of the ones that are numbers. So that becomes very useful because we could do that within our data set and we don't have to use the keyboard shortcut. We can go to the formulas ribbon, go into the name manager, and this section here for defined names, we could create from selection, and you'll notice when I hover over it, there's the keyboard shortcut Control Shift F3. If I go into the name manager, you'll see there's those various different things that were automatically named when I did the keyboard shortcut. Now how do we use these? Well actually let's imagine this is our summary sheet again. What I can do is click in a cell, and say this one equals, now rather than referring to a cell, I'm going to start typing in the thing that I used to name it. And whenever that thing is highlighted in blue, I press tab. Now when I press enter, in comes the value for oaks. I can also use this in a formula. So I could say equals the sum. What do I want the sum of? I want the sum of NUM. I want the sum of my numbers. Tab, because that was highlighted in blue, press enter, and it gives me the sum of my numbers, which is 10. When I go there to my named references sheet, you'll see the sum of those numbers is 10. 1, 2, 3, 4 gives me 10. Okay, so in a nutshell, that was how we refer to cells in Excel, going from very basics right up to some quite complicated features. I do hope you found this useful. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe down below. And as always, thank you for listening.